Today we're going to be breaking down one of the key components of the Food Safety Modernization Act's Produce Safety Rule. Our hope with this series is that we can discuss how to approach the requirements of the rule in a way that makes sense and makes them achievable on your farm. The series is brought to you by the Maryland Food Safety Network. We are a group of produce safety specialists comprised of folks from University of Maryland Extension, the Agriculture Law Education Initiative, that's the organization I work for, and the Maryland Department of Agriculture. The presenter today is Dr. Angela Forelli. She's an agent associate with the University of Maryland. So on to today's topic. Today we're going to be talking about managing wildlife and pre-harvest risk assessments. So the produce safety rule outlines requirements for monitoring wildlife and performing some pre-harvest assessments. Angela is going to walk us through some of those requirements, how to scout for signs of significant wildlife intrusion, how to establish a no harvest buffer zone, and how to establish some policies for your workers regarding when they can and should not be harvesting produce that shows signs of animal intrusion. This is a topic that we get a lot of questions about during our training, so I hope we have a lively session today. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Angela.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you everyone on the call for being with us today to kind of talk about safe ways to manage wildlife on the farm that work for you and ways that you can manage safe harvests on the farm as well. So before I get started, just as Sarah said, all of these installments are a collaborative effort between everybody in the partnership in the Maryland Food Safety Network. So if you have any questions about today's presentation or want to talk to any of us a little bit about what's going on your farm, please don't hesitate to reach out to any one of us. And then I should also add this program, as well as all university programs, are available to all without any regard to race, color, sex, gender identity or expression, sexual orientation, marital status, age, national origin, political affiliation, physical or mental disability, religion, protected veteran status, genetic information, personal appearance, or other legally protected status. So today, just as Sarah discussed, we are going to be talking about the portions of the rule that deal with wildlife and managing safe harvests. So you can see all of the PSR regulations that we're going to be touching on are in blue on this slide. So we're going to go on wildlife monitoring. We'll talk about how to identify and address different levels of animal intrusion in your field, how to train your workers to both scout for wildlife and train them to know what to do if they find wildlife in the field, train them to know how to spot if a bin is ready for harvest or if it needs to be fixed or cleaned before it can be used, train workers on how to identify what product can be harvested and what product should be culled because it might not be safe. And then we're also going to talk about managing indoor pests. And for all of these portions, we should note that records are not required for this section of the PSR. However, if you're going to be doing a gap audit, it's likely that you will have a record for animal monitoring or pest control. And then also, we like to say that keeping records is always a really good idea because it allows you to write down the due diligence that you're doing on your farm to make sure that you're farming in the most safe way you can. And it also helps you grow from year to year. So writing things down is always, always a plus. So if you remember from the PSA training, we're concerned with animals and food safety because they can carry human pathogens both in their gut, in their saliva and on their mouths and on their fur as well. But also it's important to note that animals are a really significant and important part of a healthy ecosystem. So it's a balance of managing animals on an outside farm and also in indoor facilities as well. So below we have three examples of some animal intrusion you might find in your field, and they all carry different amounts of food safety risk. On the left here, we have evidence of birds eating your blueberries. In the middle, we have evidence of animals by tracks. And on the far right, we have the calling card of all animals, which is some poop next to a squash. And so the PSR wants growers to make an assessment of the evidence that they see in the field and how that translates to significant food safety risk, and take measures not to harvest anything that could be affected by that intrusion. So in this presentation, we're going to give you tips on how to spot what's risky, what to do in the event that you spot something really risky, how to make assessments, how to implement different policies and procedures to lower your food safety risk from animals. We talked about these a little bit in the water section of the rule, but risk assessments are always, they're throughout each module of the produce safety rule. And being able to make your own risk assessment is integral to this part in wildlife, because challenges that you're going to face are unique to your farm. And how I like to go about risk assessments is asking 3 different questions, especially when in terms of wildlife. The first question is, what have I identified as a potential hazard? And then you translate that to, okay, what can I do about that? And what sort of policies can I put in place to keep that hazard from happening? And then you also want your backup plans for, okay, what do I have in place in case it happens? So we know from time to time you are going to find poop in the field. So having a plan in place before you see the poop helps you deal with the poop more efficiently and more safely. So we'll talk about each of these 3 questions. The first question, what have I identified as a potential hazard on your farm? So that's going to be really unique to you, and you can break it down into 4 or more different components, but I've listed 4 basic ones here. So the hazards that you have on the farm are going to be dependent on what sort of animals you have on your farm. Do you have livestock as well? Do you have free-range guinea fowl? Do you have poultry, or do you have some fainting goats? Where are they housed? Where you're storing their manure? And where is that in relation to where you're growing produce? So that factors into it. Your common wildlife problems. So if you know that you have gophers are your biggest problem, then that's going to be your target for managing wildlife. You're going to target that management on those gophers. Conversely, if you're doing blueberries, right, then your main wildlife might be deer or birds. And in that case, you're going to target your management strategies and your efforts on those deer and those birds. It can also be on what sort of produce that you're growing. So if you're growing higher risk produce like leafy greens or strawberries, or if you're growing a little bit lower risk produce like sweet corn, that will kind of figure out where you need to target. And then finally, the area you live in as well. And what is baked into that, it includes the things that are happening not only with your neighbors, but also in the area in general. Do you have any feedlots near you? Are you going to have to worry about runoff from that? Or dairies? Do you have any landfills near you that could potentially bring in seagulls or anything that have been eating on human trash? So all of those things kind of factor into what are my hazards. And once you get a good handle on identifying what your hazards are, then that helps you target what your risk reduction strategies are going to be. What are the biggest bang for your buck policies that you're going to put in place to reduce your risk? So we set it up in this structure, right? We've got policies to support you, that you train your workers on, so that if everybody's trained right, then we're minimizing risk from wildlife and we can safely harvest. And then SOPs, standard operating procedures, are going to be your support system that you put in place that tells your workers how exactly you want them to do an activity. And then finally, we've got record keeping here. So again, record keeping is not required, but record keeping and monitoring logs, pre-harvest checklists, and harvest equipment cleaning records can help you also identify if the SOPs that you put in place are being followed. So I have a couple examples of some policies you can put in place, and some of these are PSR requirements, SOPs that you can put in place to support those policies, and written logs to support the SOPs that all are good risk reduction management strategies. And we'll talk about each of these. And then the third part of risk assessment is also putting in place plans for if the less than optimal happens. So if the poop hits the fan, and that's going to happen because you're farming outside, right? So the main policies we want to have in place now before they happen is, what are you going to do if you see one of your workers making a mistake, right? So how are we going to retrain them if they're not inspecting the bins, or if you see them harvesting something that they should not be harvesting? And also another big policy that we'll talk about is, how are you going to take measures that are reasonably necessary to identify and not harvest anything that could be contaminated or could have contamination on it? right? And again, standard operating procedures can support those policies that you put in place. So training your workers on exactly how you want to put flags in the field to denote no harvest buffer zone, how exactly you want them to either remove or bury feces, and how you want them to clean and where you want them to store the feces removal equipment. That's all important to kind of lay out before it happens so that when it happens, it's just muscle memory. And again, written logs can support the SOPs. And together, the policies, SOPs, and written logs not only help you deal with the acute event that happens, but it also initiates a mechanism that you can use to continually kind of evaluate what's going on my farm, what are the problems that I dealt with last year, how can I, get ahead of the ball and minimize my risk this season. So now we're going to transition into talking about some of the things you could put in place on your farm in terms of wildlife and safe harvests to align with the produce safety rule. And the first one is setting yourself up for success before planting. So this can be a passive or active strategy or a combination of the two. Again, it kind of depends on what's going on your farm. And I would also say what's going on your farm both now and historically, and what's going on your neighbor's farm. If you have the flexibility to site different plots, like next season before you start, using things to your advantage, like the elevation or different elevations on your farm, if you've got hills, prevailing wind direction, vegetative buffers, fences, and containing animal waste in structures if you have animals on the farm. So all of those things can be passive barriers that minimize anything going on with animals from interacting negatively with your produce patch. You can also elect to take a more active approach. We would just ask that you have to, that you follow all of Maryland laws if you're taking that active approach to reduce animal activity around your produce patch. Another thing that you can do to align with the PSR in this portion is monitoring for animal activity. So how often that you scout or monitor, it will also be driven by what's going on your farm, right? The type of animal activity that you normally have, your normal pressures. And when you do it is based on what you deem is necessary. So you can do it throughout the season. If you have a particular time in your season, like in June or early in the season, you have migratory birds, then you're going to want to scout more during the higher levels of animal activity that you know of, right? And you're also definitely going to want to scout for animal activity right before harvest. So everything in green in the next two slides are especially important right before harvest. So when you are monitoring, not all evidence of animal intrusion is going to be actionable by you. Again, the PSR states that you've got to determine if the intrusion is considered significant evidence of potential contamination. So if the intrusion is significant. And I like to use, I just found this recently, this really handy chart on the right here. And this was developed by our friends at Michigan State University. And it helps you kind of categorize the different intrusion that you might see in a field and how widespread it might be in the field. And it helps you categorize the relative risk. So they've outlined tracks, crop damage, and poop. And then they've also outlined, okay, you can see it either once in the field, sporadically, or widespread. So as you can see, they've characterized widespread crop damage and poop as high risks. So those are definitely actionable. But other instances, like I would say feces contamination, these are moderate risks. So these are also actionable. Use this chart to kind of set up what your actionable limit is in your farm. And I will say it might be a moving target, or it is a moving target, because as we get closer to harvest, the risk of animal intrusion increases. All right, another question we get a lot is, okay, you want us to go out and monitor for animals. Well, how do I do it? There's a couple of different strategies that you can use to scout or monitor for animal intrusion. And they're summarized pretty well in this URL or resource I have down here. And Sarah's going to put that into the chat. It will also be available at the end of the presentation for you to take and look at on your own. This again was developed by Michigan State University, and it kind of goes through a couple different strategies that you can use to scout. You can go around the perimeter of your field if that works for you. You can randomly sample different rows to go down. You can use records of animal monitoring from past seasons to kind of pinpoint where you're going to scout along high activity areas. And then also, right before and during harvest, you're going to want to have your workers trained on what to look for so they can continually scout for you when they're down in the rows. So if they know what they're looking for and they know when to stop, then that's less that you have to deal with if they, come in with a lug and some of that lug has potential poop on it or other contamination, and you have to deal with that. All right. So another question we get is, what do we do with our findings from monitoring? So if you find significant evidence of animal intrusion, then you want to initiate a procedure to protect the rest of your crop from that potential contamination. And you've got a couple of strategies at your disposal that you can use. You can bury it, whatever's affected, remove it, and or flag it. And this will be depending on what your specific farm standard operating procedure is. And we'll get into that in a second. And what your own risk assessment is of that particular situation. It's also important to call any product with visible poop or other contamination on it, like if it's eaten, because it's not, you're not going to harvest that. No one's going to buy that. And especially if you're close to harvest, establishing a no harvest buffer zone can minimize your food safety risk even more by lowering the chance of anyone harvesting anything that could potentially have splash or other transfer from that epicenter of contamination on it. All right, so we're going to do a wee bit of an activity here. Let's pretend that we sent someone out to monitor various fields that we've got, and they come back with 3 different findings for us. So they went to one field and they saw evidence of deer tracks. And this was, let's say this is a squash field, summer squash. We got summer squash and they see deer tracks in it. So that's scenario 1. And then we have, he walked along the rows a little bit more and he saw a poop next to some squash. That'll be scenario 2. And then finally, this person gets in their car to scout a field of beans that you have, of green beans. As they drive down the perimeter of the field, they see this, which is a full flock of like geese. Okay. So let's go to the chat real quick. And I want you to answer in these 3 different scenarios. So what about scenario 1? Would you say that this is significant intrusion if we just see, if we see tracks? Oh, I see a no. Anybody else? Oh, I see another no. Yeah, I would agree because we're only seeing tracks. All right. What about poop next to the squash? Would you say this is actionable? Yes or no? For a significant level of intrusion? Looking at the chat. Waiting for a brave soul. There we go. Oh, yes. Thank you. Thank you, Melinda. Yeah, so I would also say this is actionable. We would definitely want to do something with that poop. And then finally, what about our 3rd observation? Going along the perimeter here and seeing this geese. Would this be actionable? Yes or no? Don't be shy. I've got a couple of these engagements ready for you. Thanks, Melinda. Yes. Yes, so I would agree. This is definitely, yes, actionable. And this is a instance of kind of potentially widespread animal intrusion. So if you see something like this, then you would want to get your supervisor out there, really comb through that field and see if this field can be harvested or not. So if you have a lot of poops in that field, then we want to kind of figure out, can we even harvest this field, or are we going to have to do something else? Okay. So say we've got someone out monitoring these, imagine we have got a strawberry field here. All right, this is another scenario. And it's a tiny field. We have someone go out and scout it. And because it's tiny, they're able to scout all the rows and they find these different poops. So we determined that poops are actionable, significant evidence of intrusion. So what do we do with these poops? Well, you can also ask questions about where we are in the strawberry growing season, right? So if fruits aren't present, maybe your SOP can be remove the poop and return to work. If the strawberries are growing, but they're not ready for harvest yet, maybe the SOP could be remove the poop and call any likely affected berries. So any berries that have visible poop on them or are right next to berries that have visible poop on them, wash the poop removal equipment and return to work. Then the 3rd question, if we're close to harvest, right? We have to employ a buffer zone, a no harvest buffer zone, because if a splash event happens while that poop is there, poop from the epicenter of where it happened can travel to, away from where the actual poop was and potentially contaminate berries that aren't necessarily touching poop, but they could have splash on them. And we don't want anybody harvesting anything that could have poop on it. We get this question a lot too. So how big should our buffer zones be? And the PSR does not determine the size of what your no harvest buffer zone should be. So again, we want to train our employees and train the supervisors to be able to make a risk assessment about what's going on in the situation to deploy what an appropriate no harvest buffer zone is. So you can ask questions like, all right, what are the feces characteristics? If the poop is kind of all together and crumbly, then it's less likely that it will splash, compared to if it's more like a creamed corn substance, then it's going to likely splash, and your no harvest buffer zone should be a little bit more conservative. Again, think about the crop type. So if you have a high risk crop and if you have a crop that's low to the ground, you might want to have a wider buffer zone than if you have a crop that's lower risk or higher up from the ground. Also think about the last precipitation event. Did it just rain before you scouted, or did you just turn on the irrigation? Water can precipitate these splash events, which would mean that we would need a little bit bigger of a buffer zone. So be aware of when the last time the field had water on it. And then this last one, which is biggie, the time to harvest. So the closer you are to harvest, you want to make a bigger buffer zone. In terms of recommending what buffer zone you should use, well, science is just really not at that point to give a one-size-fits-all recommendation yet. We do have a couple of things that we can recommend. So the Leafy Greens marketing agreement has set out a no harvest buffer zone of 1.5 meters, which is a little under 5 feet. And that's been corroborated in scientific journals to reduce food safety risk. There have been some worst case scenario studies that have been undertaken by New York, where fresh poop was placed in the field, and then that field was irrigated, and then lettuce was immediately harvested from that field. And scientists from those studies found that 89% of lettuce they sampled 3.3 feet away, which is about a meter, had measurable poop on it. And another study found that lettuce that was 6.5 feet away did not have any E. coli on it. So those are kind of our boundaries that we're working with. And the math from these studies was able to propose that for every half meter of buffer that you put in, you can reduce your food safety risk. So that's all to say that scientists are still working on this question of what the buffer should be to be able to relay that information to you. But in the meantime, it's really important that everyone feels comfortable that they can take their own risk assessments into account when developing the no harvest buffer zones. Is there evidence of splash? What are the characteristics of the poop? Did you just run the irrigation? So all of that might lead you to more conservative of a buffer zone. And I would be conservative, especially if you're close to harvest and especially if you're dealing with a high risk crop. It's important to note here that the regulators are not asking you to have a set buffer zone for 100% of the time, but they want to see that you're making these risk assessments, that you're acting appropriately, and that you're seeing that your workers are trained in that protocol or those expectations that you have set forward. And a good way to do that is to create standard operating procedures. Standard operating procedures are the gold standard of standardizing an activity, and it provides an expectation or a foundation for an expectation for how you want to handle significant wildlife intrusion. You can also use SOPs for any farm activity, but we'll just talk about SOPs for handling significant wildlife intrusion here. So I like to think of SOPs as recipes. They are explicit and exacting in nature, and they detail what the activity is, who it applies to, what your expectation is as the operator, what they need, the materials they need to do the activity right, and also the procedure. In terms of dealing with significant wildlife intrusion, it might be useful for you to create two basic SOPs, one for dealing with significant intrusion that somebody finds during the growing season, and one that is closer to harvest. So for example, what you could do is have one SOP where the procedure states, during the growing season, if you find poop or other significant wildlife intrusion, you can bury the poop and then clean the instrument. But if you're closer to harvest, you're not only going to bury the poop and clean the instrument, but you're also going to flag to put forth those no harvest buffer zones. And because your workers and you are trained to spot food safety risks like poop splash, the actions that they take can be more conservative than the SOP that you set out, right? And that's why it's really important to get everybody kind of on board with being comfortable with assessing risk for what the situation is. And we have at the end of the presentation 2 sample procedures that you can use to make your own SOPs for this part. All right, we're back to our strawberry field. So, as you know, in Maryland, sometimes we will harvest the same field multiple times, and strawberries are a case of that. So it's 3 days past that first time we harvested, that first time we saw those poops, and we didn't use any flags that first time we went out. So can you guys enter into the chat how many poops do you remember we found in that field? Anyone want to take a guess on number? Go ahead, enter it into the chat. It's between 1 and 8. Okay, I see a 5. And would anyone else want to offer up? 5's a good guess. Oh, I see a 6. Very good, guys. Nice. So there actually were 6 poops in that field. Here's the second kicker. Do you remember which rows they were in? So we have row 1, 2, 3, and 4. Can you enter into the chat which row did not have any poops in it? Ooh, we have a 3, we have a 2. Great. It was actually, yeah, it was row 3, didn't have any poops in it. But we did this exercise kind of just to show that without flags, it's really hard. Without having a visual cue, it's kind of hard for workers to remember where they need to avoid if they're harvesting a crop multiple times. So even after time passes, any contamination from the poop might still be in that space. So we want to continue to avoid it if we're harvesting the same area multiple times. So I'm a big proponent of flags. And to that point, again, this is included in the end of the presentation. Here are 3 sort of places you can get your flags from. There are 30-inch flags you can get, 21-inch flags, 15-inch flags. My personal favorite came from this site because the reviews were great. Best dang flags I've ever bought. A gift from the gods, and my personal favorite review of wire flags. So they come in packs of hundreds. So I definitely recommend flags. So now that we're pros at risk assessment, it's time for harvest. What do we need to do to ensure safe harvest? So the PSR states that your crew needs to take measures reasonably necessary to identify and not harvest anything that could be contaminated. So at a minimum, that means a visual assessment of the growing area and the produce likely to be harvested, regardless of how you're harvesting. So I would recommend use those SOPs we just talked about to get that requirement checked off, right? To help you harvest anything, to help you not harvest anything that could be contaminated, following an SOP that you have your workers deal with any signs of significant contamination and flagging the area and using a no harvest buffer zone is what I would also recommend. And other things you can include in a pre-harvest assessment before going out each day to harvest is checking if workers are trained, if everybody knows what they should be harvesting and what they shouldn't be harvesting, having a once-over, checking if the bins are clean and other harvesting tools, if the cart is clean and sanitized that you're putting the bins onto, do the workers have enough water? And you can make it easy on yourself by making it a Google Doc checklist by putting it just on your phone. Again, our friends at Michigan State University made a really nice checklist where you can just go bing, bang, boom, and then it will auto-populate onto a record. So something that your workers should be trained on is checking how clean their harvesting containers are every time before they go out to the field. And the things that you want them to look for is there gross debris in the lug from the last day? We definitely want to clean that out before we start putting nice, fresh, new tomatoes into that lug. Are there any cracks or anything else, splinters in the harvesting lug? Because these cracks will make that a little bit harder to clean, and it also creates a little niche for microbes to get into and grow, and we don't want that. So if they see any cracks, they should put that or be trained to put that over to the side so you can fix it or install a liner or maybe retire that lug. Other things to look for is caked on mud, insect pieces, or evidence of other pests, as these can all be harbingers of germs and contamination. And if we're doing all this work to make sure that animals in the field aren't, disrupting the safety of our product, once it's picked, we don't want to then put it into a dirty bin. So some examples here. This box would not be suitable for harvest. This is a wood box. It's full of, I think we've got mold and some water damage here. So, and because this is wood, this is going to be really hard to clean and sanitize to get it to be suitable for harvest. So I would recommend that we retire this box. You can also use, if you like, you can also use sanitary liners to create, or a one-use liner to create a sanitary surface in your harvesting lugs. Now, this is a plastic container, so you can clean and sanitize this, but you can also provide another level of assurance if you'd like by adding one-use liners. All right, so other harvesting considerations it would be good to train your workers on is to wash into the field before beginning harvest or returning from a break. This is especially important for those diversified farms that also have livestock on the farm, because we want to make sure that any work going on with the livestock is not being tracked into the produce field. So maybe you set it up where they change boots between working with the fainting goats and going to the produce patch, or they wear specific clothes for doing types of activities, and they should be washing their hands. Having plenty of water, encouraging open communication between you and your workers for them to notify or flag you if they're not sure if they should harvest something. And some good don'ts here are to train everybody, don't harvest anything that look like it could be contaminated. If you're cutting something like lettuce, don't put the cut surface of the lettuce in contact with the soil, because that is one way that germs can travel from the soil into the plant, is from that cut surface. And don't harvest any dropped produce. So if you remember from the PSA training, dropped produce are things that fall onto the ground and they are not okay to harvest. And this is because the bruising of something dropping to the ground can create a possible entryway for a pathogen. We don't want that. So the FDA considers produce that drops on the ground before harvest, during harvest, or after harvest as dropped produce, as well as things that were staked up but then flop over and drop to the ground. And that's because of this bruising. Things that are not dropped produce are things that grow on the ground, like cucumbers, melons, strawberries attached to the plant that are growing on plastic culture, or other root vegetables. But again, I would caution that being trained in risk assessment is important here too, because you can't have a situation like you're growing bush tomatoes on plastic culture, but that plastic culture has some bird poop on it. And if you have a rain event that mixes the bird poop into a puddle that now the tomatoes are sitting in, it's good to know that your workers are trained to spot that as a risk and not harvest it. Other management tactics like skirting or installing signs, if you have a pick your own to tell people do not harvest drops, can also help you mitigate your risk here. All right, so a lot of diversified farms in Maryland have some sort of livestock or pets or other working animals on the farm, and that's all fine. We definitely encourage that, but it just requires another kind of level of thinking of how we're going to separate the two activities of what's going on with livestock and animals and your fresh produce patch, so you don't have any cross-contamination, or you minimize the chance of cross-contamination. So important questions to ask if you've got livestock, pets, or working animals on the farm is, okay, number one, where's their housing located? Is it located near the produce patch, or is it located near a water source where runoff from their poops can get into my water source? We definitely don't want that. Is there housing near a highly trafficked area between the produce patch and the pack house? We want to minimize that too, because you could track things through into the pack house, and we don't want that. What sort of worker training is in place? So again, are workers trained to know that they need to wash out of animals, working with animals, and wash into produce? Do they need to change their shoes? Those are different policies you can put in place. Do you have hand wash setups available? So especially if you've got agritainment, if you've got fainting goats and you've got like pick your own strawberries, you definitely want your customers to and encourage them to wash their hands between visiting the animals and picking strawberries, or maybe you create a unidirectional flow where first they pick and then they pet. And can you train the animal? So that's important too. Because, for example, I do know a couple of farms in Maryland that have guinea hens that they use for an integrated pest management. And that's great, but you can't train the guinea hens to not poop in a specific area. So in Maryland, if you've got guinea hens going around and they poop, that's actually considered a manure application in the field, right? But things like dogs, sometimes you can train them. So we do know that you have guard dogs and other working animals. Some people have horses that they work or mules that they have in the field. And the best case scenario is to not have them around when the crop is present. But if they must be around during production, you can train them to minimize those infield poop events. And the spruce had a nice training on how to potty train your dog to poop in one specific area. So I definitely encourage anybody who has dogs to visit this site and see how well they can, how well it works. And then again, you're going to have to devise a plan of what to do in case you do have that poop event in the field. If the dog just gets excited and poops, and that might happen. So planning beforehand will help you deal with that when it happens. Animals that pick your own farms. So pets should not be coming to pick your owns, unfortunately, because of the food safety risk. You can get this sign from MDA. It's on our website, and you can also post this on your website to let customers know of your expectations before they arrive at your farm. Service animals are allowed on your farm, and the only two service animals are dogs and miniature horses. And so I have up here a guide from University of Georgia that you can read. It's also included at the end of the presentation. So these types of service animals are allowed on your farm. You can only ask 2 specific questions about them under the ADA, and you should provide, if you think you're going to have service animals on the farm, you as an operator should provide a designated area for them to relieve themselves. And there are a couple of other things that you want to think about and bake into your operation if you think you're going to have service animals on the farm, and they're all kind of laid out in this PDF. So I'd encourage you to go check that out. All right, to finish out this presentation, we're going to talk about some of the requirements for managing pests in indoor facilities or partially enclosed buildings. So in a nutshell, the rule wants you to take measures, again, that are reasonably necessary to protect produce, food contact surfaces, and packing material from contamination. So it's not required that you record pest monitoring for the PSR, but again, it's a really good idea to do so because you're going to need it if you're going to do a gap audit. And if you are implicated in an outbreak, documenting your due diligence will only help you. So for enclosed buildings, you need to prevent pest entry for as best you can. This can be done by not keeping doors open all the time, repairing holes or doing other maintenance in the facility, keeping accumulated culls or other litter to a minimum, taking the trash out every day, maintaining the grounds and storing equipment in such ways that kind of discourage pests from housing in them, things like that. For partially enclosed buildings, the target is going to be preventing establishments from pests. So we know it's going to be almost impossible to prevent an errant bird from flying through. But if you have a partially enclosed building, then we want to kind of see that you're not allowing those birds to nest in that area, that you're removing the nest and you're setting up other sort of deterrents like screens or something to to make it not as to make it an area that they're not going to want to nest in. Monitoring and action. So again, like most things with wildlife, how often you monitor, either weekly or bi-monthly or monthly, is going to be determined on your level of risk assessment and pest activity that you have. When addressing pests, make sure that you're not placing pest control measures on food contact surfaces or on packaging, and make sure that you're following all the laws with regards to pesticide use. I would say shy away from using poison baits because they can be a hazard for our predatory birds in the area. And also important to note on this side that cats are not allowed in fully enclosed packing house buildings, and they should not be in partially enclosed packing house buildings. And they're not a approved method of pest reduction because they can contain toxoplasma in their gut, which is a human pathogen. All right. So with that, that's the end of the seminar for today. I encourage you guys to sign up for next month's seminar. We're going to be talking about how to develop a cleaning and sanitizing program for all of your food contact surfaces and the equipment that you have on the farm. And with that, I'll take any questions you have, and I'll say that all the references for the presentation are located in this QR code. So what you can do is take your camera out from your phone, and you just hover over this QR code, and it should direct you to download a PDF. We can also send it along with the post-webinar correspondence that Sarah has, in which an eval will also be sent to you to let us know if you like this presentation and if you want to hear more from us. So with that, I'll take any questions.
I think you covered everything, Angela. I don't see any questions. If anyone wants to unmute themselves and would rather ask the question, they can go ahead and do that also. Okay, we've got a question, Angela. It's from Melinda. Could a grower reduce risk of fecal splatter by adding a field scan for poop before a rain or irrigation?
Yeah, if you want to bake into your SOP that, every few weeks you're going to look out for when you've got rain in the forecast and you're going to scout before that rain, I think that's a great idea. So then you deal with the issue before we have the potential for splash. So you can certainly do that. That's a great example of making it work for you.
I think we might be ready to close it out, Angela. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I hope everyone has a nice weekend, and join us on September 18th for the next webinar in this series. So mark your calendars for September 18th. Thanks, everybody.